Check the description for the following discount codes. I wanted to do this quick follow-up video from my review of the Thrustmaster T-LCM pedals on Friday, because we've had like differing experiences with plugging these pedals into a Thrustmaster wheelbase on PC. Now for me, plugging them in using the RJ12 cable, and before I did that, this is a good point actually, I had one guy in the comments repeatedly telling me that I hadn't read the instructions and that I obviously hadn't updated the firmware, even though I told him that I had. I don't know whether he doesn't believe me or what, but anyway, the first thing I did, and this goes for anything I review really, is get the latest drivers down and obviously check if there's a firmware update, because these days every bloody thing has firmware and software updates. Even my toothbrush has updatable firmware on it, my electric toothbrush. So obviously, as a methodical guy and a technically minded guy, the first thing I did was get the drivers down and check for firmware updates. Now, there's currently no firmware updates for the pedals themselves, and it actually says literally on the Thrustmaster website, to date, no firmware update of the pedal set is required, only the firmware update of your racing wheels base. So obviously, having read both on the website and in the user manual in PDF format that I need to update my steering wheel base's firmware, that's what I did. Otherwise the wheelbase doesn't know what these pedals are, because the wheelbases all came out before the pedals did. So I updated the firmware, checked the drivers with the latest drivers, which they were. In fact, there's no drivers for these pedals either. I think it actually, it says it's plug and play device. It installs automatically on PC driver. Downloads not required. So everything was done as it should be from a software and firmware point of view. And my wheelbase, there is a mode light in the bottom left-hand corner. This mode light will either stay on solid or it will flash 10 times when you first power it up to tell you which mode it's in. Whether it's in the mode for the T3PA and T3PA Pro pedals, or whether it's in the higher resolution mode for the T-LCM pedals. So, lo and behold, I plug it in with the RJ12 cable. Firmware's all up to date, as I mentioned. Turn it on, and my light flashes 10 times exactly like it's supposed to. So looking at my wheelbase, the wheelbase is in T-LCM mode, like it should be. And yet my PC does not see or register any input from the pedals whatsoever. It sees the TSPC Racer wheelbase, all the buttons on the steering wheel work, all the buttons on the base work, steering wheel input works just fine, paddles work just fine, but just not the pedals. It's like they're not there. And I actually got it all out again, like today, just to try and get it to work again, because some of you lot are saying, obviously, you've got it and it works just fine. And again, according to the instructions, it's supposed to work, but it doesn't. And I'll get onto why I said about console users being able to just use it all through one USB in a minute. But yes, it looks like it's supposed to work, but for me, it just doesn't work. I have to plug the pedals in via USB. So I got everything out again today. You can see the rig's behind me there, the box is over there. I even had to go up in the loft to get the RJ12 cable back out. In fact, if I turn that over there, you can see my steps in the background there, and a big cardboard box that it was all in the loft. I thought, I'm going to try this again. So once again, I've updated the firmware, even though it didn't need it. I did it again. I've tried every single USB port on my computer. So that's USB 2, USB 3, and even USB-C using a C to A adapter. I've tried it with USB hubs like this, and just plugged into every port individually, even the USB-C on my RTX 2080. And the pedals just still do not work plugged into the wheelbase, and then the wheelbase plugged into the PC. So I don't know whether my T-LCMs are faulty. Maybe there's a fault with my wheelbase. Maybe it's just one of those quirks that we get on PC where sometimes things just don't work well together. There's so many different hardware configurations: motherboards, CPUs, RAM, graphics cards, USB headers. Not everything always works, so it could just be one of those random anomalies. But yeah, one of the other things this guy that was telling me I hadn't read the instructions and done the firmware update said was that my review looks bad on me because I said they don't work. And it's quite the opposite. I have to review what I have in front of me, and I have to share my experience with whatever the given product is with you guys. I can't base a review on what something is supposed to do. If it doesn't do it, it doesn't do it. It's as simple as that. And for me, in spite of firmware updates, driver updates, trying every single USB port, and now having done this all twice, I've probably spent 3 hours trying to get these to work. And like it says on the Thrustmaster website, they're plug and play. It's just supposed to plug them in, although you do have to update the firmware. So even they're not strictly being accurate on their side, because without the firmware update, it's not going to work. But for me, even with the firmware update, it still doesn't work. Now, when I first had this problem, obviously I went to Google to try and find a solution to see if it's just me having this problem or if it's a known fault or whatever it might be. And what I found was quite a few people saying that they've got a similar problem, but if they plug it into their console, then the pedals are recognised and they work. There was a mixture of that combined with people saying my accelerator and brake register, but my clutch doesn't. Or people saying my brake and my clutch register, but my accelerator pedal doesn't work. And all sorts of mixtures of combinations of some of the pedals working and some of them not. Now, again, this could all just be down to differences in the configuration of our PCs. You know, and speaking of PCs, my Windows install is only about a month old, so that's pretty fresh as well. You know, so you know either the pedals, the software from Thrustmaster, just the firmware that goes into the wheelbase, and then the drivers for the wheelbase isn't the best, or they just don't play well with various PC configurations. You know, I don't think I'm ever going to know the answer to that. But I have to review the experience I get. You know, and my experience with trying to use them through the wheelbase was that it was a fail. It didn't work. So that's what I have to relay to you guys. I can't say, yeah, it's all good, it's great, you can plug them into your wheelbase and it works, because for me it doesn't work, no matter how hard I tried. So in spite of doing everything correctly twice now, trying every USB port, they still just don't work. They work absolutely fine standalone through USB, no problem whatsoever. And as I say, the wheelbase knows they're plugged in. The LED flashes 10 times to acknowledge they're there and it's in the right mode, but the communication then just doesn't get to the game control panel or Thrustmaster control panel on the PC for whatever reason. No idea. But yeah, then I mentioned about how console users can plug pedals, shifter, and even their handbrake into the wheelbases and just use the one USB port. And this is correct. If you've got a TH8A shifter and you're on console, you can plug it in, this is PlayStation or Xbox, you can plug it into the wheelbase and it will function as an H-pattern shifter, or you can swap the little top bit over and it will switch to a sequential shifter. On the PC, you can't do this, it doesn't work. If you want to use it as an H-pattern shifter, you have to get the USB lead and plug it into a dedicated USB port. The same goes for the Thrustmaster TSS handbrake. On console, if you want to use it as a handbrake, you can plug it into the wheelbase, you've got an analog handbrake, no problems whatsoever. If you're on PC and you want to use it as a handbrake, you have to plug it in to a dedicated USB port. It will not work if you plug it in to the wheelbase. The only functionality you get with the TSS or the TH8A on PC plugged into your wheelbase is it mirrors your two paddles on the steering wheel. That's all it does. You can't use it as an H-pattern shifter. You can't use a handbrake as a handbrake. And this is why, you know, in the end of the last video, I was like, I don't know why Thrustmaster do this, because if they can do it on console, where you can plug your shifter into your wheelbase and your pedals into your wheelbase, and then just have one USB going into the console, why can't we, and use it as an H-pattern, or if you're doing the handbrake, use the handbrake as a handbrake, why can't we? There's no need for it to be this way. It's only down to the software. So what I said at the end of the video there is 100% correct. You know, and from my experience with the pedals, they do not work plugging into the wheelbase. Now, perhaps I should have added in the words, for me, they do not work, because it did sound a bit definitive, which perhaps wasn't the correct way to word it. But that's why I'm following it up with this and sharing with you exactly what I did to try and get it to work, and also what I meant by Thrustmaster giving console users the option to have these peripherals plugged into their wheelbase and just have one neat, tidy solution. Now, moving on from that, a few comments were talking about the difference in resolution, 10 or 12-bit versus 16-bit. Because if you plug the pedals into a wheelbase, and they work, you only get 12-bit resolution for each of the 3 pedals. And if you go via USB, you get a 16-bit resolution. Now, what does this actually mean in real world terms? How does it affect our ability to play our games, driving our sims? Well, the bottom line is it really doesn't. And I'll explain a bit more detail about this. On paper, the higher resolution, the more smooth and accurate the input on those pedals will be. But there is a diminishing point of sort of returns here. Once you get over a certain resolution, you could go higher and higher and higher, but you won't feel or experience any noticeable difference in the game, in the sim. Now, 12-bit resolution gives us 4,096 individual steps. Now, what does that mean? When you press the brake pedal and it moves, say it's 2 inches of travel, or however far it actually moves. Let's say it's 2 inches, about that. That 2 inches of travel is split into 4,096 individual points. So you imagine grabbing a tape measure, looking at 2 inches and splitting that into 4,096 individual little lines on your tape measure. You wouldn't even be able to do it. Those lines would be so small and so close together, they just look like one long straight line. Now that's 12-bit, 4,096. If you go 16-bit, the increase is massive. And so on paper, it looks brilliant. You go from 4,000 odd to 65,000 individual points over that 2 inches of travel on your pedal. Now that's just beyond ridiculous. Again, if you were to get your tape measure, pull it out to 2 inches and try and draw 65,000 lines in your 2 inch gap, obviously you can't do it. That would also look like a continuous line, albeit perhaps a touch denser or darker than the one with 4,000 on. But, to put this in sort of an engineering term, and Americans particularly will appreciate this because you still use inches and thousandths of an inch. So if I was to be building an engine at work, for example, and I was to check the bore wear to see, let's say I've got an engine, I've stripped it down, I want to see whether I need to rebore and go larger piston or whether I can just hone the bores because they haven't ovaled and there isn't too much wear. The typical bore wear sort of tolerance that I would use is somewhere between 1 or 2 and 3 thousandths of an inch. Now, a thousandths of an inch, it's hard to say, is getting 1 inch and splitting it into 1,000, right? And that is precise enough for, top-end engine building sort of interference fits and clearances and tolerances. So you get your 1 inch and you split it into 1,000. What we're talking about here at 12-bit, that 4,096 individual steps is, say, about 2 inches of travel. So that's 2,000 separate marks per 1 inch. That's double the resolution of what we measure engineering tolerances in when building engines. And the same applies to measuring the clearances of your big end and main shells on the crankshaft and the bottom of the conrod. You put your plastic gauge in and you measure it in thousandths of an inch. So that kind of puts it in a real world perspective. Having 4,096 individual points over that small 2 inches of travel is plenty. Like, it's more than enough. If we were to go the other end of the scale, go from 4,096, let's just say you've got 4 individual points over 2 inches, that obviously would be terrible because you'd move it a quarter of the way and then it'd step up, and you'd move it another quarter, so you'd be halfway, and it would step up, and then 3/4 step up, and then finally you'd be flat out all the way down, and that would be your 4th mark. That would be horribly jerky, whether it's on the brake pedal or the accelerator or the clutch, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, up and down. Terrible. 4,096 over 2 inches, absolutely loads. 65,000 over that 2 inches of travel. Phenomenal amount of resolution and, you know, totally unnecessary in my opinion. Maybe some of you guys can genuinely tell the difference between running 12-bit and 16-bit. I'd love to hear it if you can, because I personally think it's almost impossible. But that's the difference between the two. That is how it works, and to put it in a real world sort of explanation. And yeah, that's my experience with those T-LCM pedals. And someone else said I was a bit harsh on the pedals. I'm not harsh on things. I just try to be honest and direct, you know, and not fluff things up at the end of the day. If there's something at a certain price point that could be done better, or there's something else on the market or very close to it in price point that's noticeably better, then you should be comparing those two things, you know, because it's like, well, should I buy this one, Carl? Or should I buy this one? And it's like, well, that one's a little bit more money, but it's much better build quality. Or, you know, this one's quite a bit more money, but actually there's not a lot in it. You know, those are the sort of comparisons that I think I should be making. And they're the sort of questions that you lot should be asking. You know, do I want pedals that are mostly made of plastic? Another comment, in fact, I'm going to respond to some comments here. Another comment was, you know, the metal thing's overrated, Carl. You know, there's nothing wrong with plastic. Well, that isn't really true. Plastic is flexible. It can twist, it can creak, it can stretch, it can bend. You know, metal, on the other hand, is much more rigid, much stiffer, far less likely to flex. Of course, it can if given enough force. But all these things are way advantageous over something made of plastic. There's a reason our cars are not made of plastic. You know, your chassis are made of aluminium or steel or carbon fibre or whatever they might be. You know, they don't make cars out of plastic because they'd be too flexible. It's just the way plastic is. And when we're talking about these pedals, you know, the base is plastic. Two of the three pedals hinge on plastic. Someone did point out in the comments that the brake pedal apparently has got some metal inserted sleeves that allow the brake pedal to rotate metal on metal rather than metal on plastic. Again, I haven't taken them apart to look. I watched the Sim Racing Garage review where Barry stripped them down and commented the same. But, you know, the ones that are plastic on plastic, ultimately, that plastic, as you're using your pedals, is gradually going to wear and you're going to end up getting more and more play there. It can't really not happen because metal versus plastic, the plastic's always going to win. I mean, it might take a really long time because there isn't that much pressure on them. And if there's a little bit of lube on there as well, it's going to reduce the rate at which things wear. But, you know, when you're comparing products and you've got one 97% made of plastic and one that's 99% made of metal that's only 30 to 40 pound more, the question is going to be, should you buy that one, you know, or should you buy the plastic based one? I think it's a pretty sensible question to ask. But anyway, there's a few comments addressed and hopefully answered, and there's a little explanation about the difference between 12-bit and 16-bit, and also an elaboration on why my pedals just don't seem to work with my wheelbase, and also why I think Thrustmaster should do us PC users a favour and let us use the H-pattern shifter and the handbrake through the wheelbase and not force us to use USB. But anyway, as always, thank you very much for watching and take it easy.